start the live. They need 3 people. Osama in the back. Osama Bish. Okay. Okay. Ahmed Al Ali, CEO of Trends Research Advisory. I would like to welcome you to the Trends and Atlantic Council third annual security, here amid the COP28 discussions. It is a pleasure to stand before you as we gather to delve into the most pressing global challenges of our time. The theme of this year's conference, the soft and hard implications of climate change, reflects the depth and the breadth of this issue that we are addressing in the coming days. Throughout the panel sessions, we will explore how climate change is not just a matter of environmental concern, but also a key determinant of international security and the global financial landscape. As we engage in these discussions, I encourage you all to keep in mind 2 key points that encapsulate the essence of our conference. Climate action is security action. The security implications of climate change are no longer theoretical. They are here and they demand our collective attention. Climate action knows no boundaries. It's a global endeavor that requires collaboration, creativity, and commitment. I have no doubt that the insights and recommendations that emerge from this conference will be noteworthy and resonate far beyond these walls. Thank you for your presence and for your commitment to a sustainable and secure future. It's now time to invite our first speaker to deliver his welcoming remarks. Welcome Mr. William Wexler, Senior Director of Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, Mr. William.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellencies, my friends, my colleagues, see a lot of familiar faces here. Those of you who are joining us in person and those many more of us who are joining online around the world, welcome to the Trends Research and Advisory, and welcome from the Atlantic Council for both COP28 and the third annual conference that we are doing together on sustainable security. My name, as was mentioned, is Will Wexler. I'm the Senior Director of the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs, of which the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative is housed at the Atlantic Council. Sustainable security is a critical concept. If you look over history, there have been many periods of time when security was anything but sustainable. More recently, the sustainable system of security that was created after World War II, with Americans lead, has been under challenge. In fact, I would argue has never been as much under challenge as it is today, given what we're seeing with great power competition, given what we're seeing with the perception of American withdrawal and decline, given what we're seeing with the growth of new actors in the geopolitical scene, and given what we're seeing on transnational threats that affect us all. We know that climate change and the challenges that stem from it are every bit as critical to the long-term well-being of nations around the world as their national defense is. All the diplomats that are gathered here for COP28 to discuss the direct threat from rising temperatures that pose to our economic well-being and our physical well-being. But security planners around the world know that climate change also poses a series of indirect threats to global stability. These planners anticipate that there will be growing resource-based conflicts around the world. They anticipate larger numbers of climate-driven migrations around the world as the ice melts. The countries in the Middle East are likely affected by all of these trends. Indeed, given the region's geography that is central to world trade, its energy production that remains vital to the world's economy, its geopolitics that continue to result in a disproportionate amount of the world's conflicts and death through violence, as we're seeing today, and its climate that gives us these beautiful December days, but makes July somewhat difficult. The Middle East is likely to be the most affected regions in the world when you add all that together from the dynamics that are driven by climate change. And the security practitioners in this region and outside this region that care about this region have to look at climate change when we are anticipating what security is going to be like here for the next decades to come. To better understand exactly how those challenges will emerge and the new technologies and adaptations and approaches and policies that will emerge alongside them to deal with those challenges, we've invited the minds and voices at the forefront of this work in both the public and the private domains to share their insights here over the next 2 days. This year's conference will center on the nexus between climate change, security, and finance. The event's plenary and panel sessions will offer unique perspectives that focus on the security and financial consequences of a changing climate, with a goal to elicit insights from practitioners and experts from the region and beyond to formulate key recommendations for policymakers. We hope that by combining the perspectives here, we can inspire new ways of thinking about sustainable security, both domestically and internationally, and overcome the traditional divisions on climate change matters that undermine progress and the false dichotomy between environmental issues and security issues. These are two sides of the same coin, intricately involved with each other. To that end, we're fortunate that Trends Research and Advisory is hosting this conference in partnership with the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. And we're grateful that they brought so many prominent experts from around the region for the various sessions today and tomorrow. This year's conference, Sustainable Security, the Soft and Hard Implications for Climate Action, is an opportunity to not only contribute to the pioneering tapestry of COP28, now, of course, fully underway around us, but an opportunity to loudly underscore the enlightened self-interest that inexorably binds our societies across one planet. So, on behalf of all of my colleagues from the Atlantic Council, thank you all for joining us for what's going to be an exciting next 2 days on the sidelines of one of the most existentially necessary yearly conferences that happens around the world. It is now my pleasure and privilege to pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, the CEO of Trends Research and Advisory. Thank you very much.
Dear audience, just to let you know, we have these translation headphones in the back from English to Arabic and Arabic to English if you need. And I'd now like to welcome Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, CEO of Trends Research and Advisory, to deliver his welcoming remarks in Arabic. Welcome, Dr. Mohammed.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الصديق العزيز ويليام بوشر، مدير مركز رفيق الحريري برنامج الشرق الأوسط في المجلس الأطلسي، السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسعدني أن أرحب بكم جميعا في بداية مؤتمر ترندز المجلس الأطلسي السنوي الثالث الذي نعقده بالتعاون مع شركائنا في المجلس الأطلسي بواشنطن تحت عنوان الأمن المستدام، الآثار الناعمة والصلبة للعمل المناخي. وأود بداية أن أشير إلى أمرين. الأول أن موضوع هذا المؤتمر هو استكمال لمناقشاتنا مع شركائنا في المجلس الأطلسي العام الماضي، والذي كنا قد بدأناه في مؤتمرنا السنوي الثاني الذي عقدناه في واشنطن العام الماضي بعنوان الأمن المستدام في الشرق الأوسط، تحديات وآفاق التغيير المناخي، والذي استضفنا فيه العديد من الشخصيات رفيعة المستوى، وعلى رأسهم معالي الشيخ نهيان بن مبارك آل نهيان وزير التسامح، وأيضا معالي الدكتور سلطان الجابر رئيس مؤتمر الأطراف، وديفيد ليسرتون المستشار الأول للمبعوث الرئاسي الأمريكي الخاص لشؤون التغير المناخي، بالإضافة إلى أكثر من 30 خبير وباحث عالمي مختصين بقضايا البيئة والمناخ. وكان انعقاد هذا المؤتمر دليلا على الاهتمام الذي أوليناه في ترندز منذ وقت مبكر لقضايا المناخ. الأمر الثاني أن انعقاد مؤتمرنا السنوي الثالث اليوم يأتي مواكبا لمؤتمر كوب 28 الحدث العالمي الأهم في مجال العمل المناخي الذي تستضيفه دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، والذي يعول عليه العالم كله لرسم خريطة طريق لمواجهة الظاهرة الأخطر التي تهدد مستقبله، وهي ظاهرة التغير المناخي. ولذا كنا حريصين على أن ينعقد هذا المؤتمر في قلب هذا الحدث العالمي. أيها الحضور الكريم، تعد أزمة تغيير المناخ واحدة من أكبر مهددات الأمن العالمي بالمعنى الواسع، نظرا لما تتضمنه من مخاطر اقتصادية ومجتمعية وبيئية واجتماعية وصحية وسياسية، بل وجيوسياسية. كما تعد أكثر الأزمات المركبة التي يواجهها البشر في القرن الحالي إلحاحاً، حيث تتراكم تأثيراتها وتتزامن مع أزمات أخرى كثيرة في مجالات الاقتصاد والموارد الطبيعية وسلاسل التوريد والصراعات بين الدول وداخلها، وتتفاعل فيما بينها، حيث يزيد مجموع أثرها الإجمالي على مجموع تأثير كل منها منفرداً. وتأسيساً على ذلك سوف يستكشف هذا المؤتمر كيف يشكل تغيير المناخ عالم الأمن والتمويل على المستوى الدولي، وسوف تتضمن الجلسات العامة وجلسات النقاش وجهات نظر متنوعة تركز على الآثار الأمنية الناجمة عن تغير المناخ والفجوة التمويلية أمام تحول الطاقة. أيها الحضور الكريم، إن الهدف من هذا المؤتمر هو استخلاص رؤى وطروحات من الممارسين والخبراء من المنطقة وخارجها لصياغة توصيات محددة يمكن أن تسهم في تحقيق الأهداف المبتغاة في مؤتمر كوب 28. وكل ثقة بأن الأفكار التي سيقدمها الخبراء المشاركون في هذا المؤتمر ستمثل إضافات نوعية تقربنا من تحقيق هذه الأهداف التي يسعى لها المؤتمر والعالم كله. وأخيراً وليس آخراً، أتقدم بجزيل الشكر للمجلس الأطلسي على دعمه لهذا المؤتمر وأيضاً تواجدهم من واشنطن هنا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Now for the keynote remarks, we are honored to welcome His Excellency Dr. Adnan Shahabuddin. His Excellency is a Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and the former Acting Secretary General at OPEC. Welcome, Your Excellency.
Your Excellency, Dr. Al-Ali, Excellencies from Trend and from Atlantic Council in Washington, dear guests, participants, I'm deeply honored to have been asked to share with you some of my thoughts on this very important conference on the sustainability of security, soft and hard implications for climate action. You will be debating the rest of the day and tomorrow a number of issues related, and I'm not going to go over them. But what I want to share with you in this opening remarks, first, the urgency of climate change. We all know, and it's been recognized, that climate change poses a potential existential threat to our human civilization that's interconnected with the planet Earth as it changes. We are acutely aware at the same time that our window of opportunity to avert likely catastrophic consequences may be narrowing, and the imperative to transition to a sustainable energy system has never been clearer. At the same time, and since the commencement of this conference a few days ago, over 100 world leaders have addressed this conference, and over 70,000 have registered and are participating in different events and venues, discussing and negotiating. And despite the various perspectives, different point of views, stemming from acknowledged different national interests, they all share a desire to achieve a common goal, earnestly seeking practical pathways to meet the formidable climate change goals we are facing. The direction on the tone of this conference has already been set by the President, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber. His key messages resonate throughout this conference and throughout the coming few days, maybe a week. Now let me move and talk briefly about the interconnection of goals and climate change. It's important to recall that the adoption of 2030 SDGs of the United Nations and the Paris Agreement underscore the urgency and the need for profound transformation of the global energy system that we are talking about here. And I don't have to remind you of what are the goals of the Paris Agreement. We know them all by now. But what's important is that these goals and the social development goals are intertwined. And it seems that we may not be able to achieve all of them at the same time over a very short period of time, given that we have limited resources. So that's a very important thing, and I think you will be debating this at the rest of the conference. And especially achieving all of them simultaneously requires balancing and trade-offs, and that's what we are discussing here in this conference. You know, I have been over the decades, I'm fortunate to have met many world energy leaders, engaged with them, talked to them, learned from them. And one thing I learned that decades ago, that the discourse was about energy security, whether it's from the perspective of the consumer, security of supply, or from the perspectives of the producer like OPEC, which is security of demand. And that was the debate. But what was very clear then, and still clear to them, that to solve these opposite views, you need to talk, you need dialogue, and you need to be ready for compromise. And the same thing applies now in the climate change debate. Now things have changed. The discourse now is about energy transition, but at the same time, energy transition to achieve sustainability cannot ignore energy security. And more importantly, it cannot ignore a third pillar of the energy trilemma, which is access to affordable and clean energy for all, including those underprivileged that are in the South, which probably there are over 1 billion people. So these three things, three pillars of the energy need to be addressed at the same time. Now, from the inception of the Sustainable Development process back in 1992, it's been recognized and it's been enshrined that we all have common responsibility, but these responsibilities have to be sort of distinguished because of what has happened over 150 years of the use of energy. And this affects also attaining the social development goals and the Paris Agreement goals. Energy transition entails a comprehensive transformation from current state of the energy system to another state of the energy system. And it involves so many aspects: infrastructure, resources, end-use applications, energy services, energy behavior, lifestyle, trade, tariffs, and so on. And such a transformation can be disruptive, accompanied at the same time by what we call creative destructions. And it's simply not just about decarbonization. It's much more than just simply decarbonization. And the energy system that we are talking about, that we need to move from this state to this state, we know it's massive, complex, interconnected between national, regional, and global. And therefore, it has an inertia, a large inertia, like a big ship in the ocean. You're trying to change direction. Big ship is not easy. Same thing, this very complex, very interconnected system is very difficult to change. And you will be talking about the financial gap, the financial resources. To make that transformation needs huge resources, estimated somewhere around 4 to 5 trillion US dollars, double the current investment in the current energy system, at least doubling, if not more. And we need innovation. To do this thing, we have to spend money on research and development, and because without innovation, we may not be able to overcome some of the obstacles that are facing us. And it's great that the announcement was made at this conference by the UAE, allocating $30 billion to this investment fund, looking for solutions, which hopefully can reach 250 billion in 2030 or so. So that is a very commendable initiative. Another essential aspect of our climate action, and I'm trying to be brief because I had to put my talk quickly today. I was supposed to speak tomorrow. But another essential aspect of our climate action is addressing considerable uncertainty about the pathway that will take us from here to net zero or to sustainability. We have to remember that any of those scenarios, when you calculate it, comes out with numbers. It's based on assumptions. I have been in this business for 50 years, and not a single outlook, whether it's from OPEC or IEA or the Energy Agency in the United States or any organization, have translated into reality. So we have to remember, in addition to the complexity and massivity, the uncertainty. We have to be ready to deal with the uncertainty. And how do you deal with the uncertainty? It's prudent to consider a mix of solutions rather than one solution. Let's not focus on one solution. We have to have a mix of solutions, whether we're talking about resources, whether we're talking about policies, whether we're talking about technologies, renewable, nuclear, decarbonized fossil fuels, and so on. We have to put all of these together, hedge our risks, because that's a key thing. And that's basically why when we hear that 180 countries have pledged in this conference to triple the renewable capacity, that's a great news. That's welcome news. But let's not be misguided in understanding that's the only solution. In fact, if we focus only on renewable, it is very likely that we will have some problems in the future. We all know that the limitation of nuclear, and that's why I always ask my colleagues is that let's remember not to put all of our eggs in one basket. That's important message that we should always. So that means that we should pursue blue hydrogen, green hydrogen. We should pursue decarbonized fossil fuels and so on. And that's why the message came from His Excellency, the President of this conference yesterday, I believe. And he said it, and he is correct. He said, the science does not tell us that if we stop using fossil fuels or if we stop investing in fossil fuels tomorrow, we will get 1.5 degree. That means that we should put an emphasis on decarbonizing fossil fuels while we gradually reduce the use of unabated fossil fuels. I think that's a very clear message. And that brings me to another important point that often is ignored in the discussion, which is the importance in sustainability to remove some of the CO2 that has been placed in the atmosphere. Let's remember that over the last 150 years, 2,500 gigatons of CO2 have been placed in the atmosphere, mostly by the industrial countries, but more recently by countries like China and otherwise. Now, that's why we are in this dilemma right now. It's because of the 2,500 gigaton. And we are now moving to sustainability with a carbon budget of only about 250 gigatons available for us before we cross the 1.5 degree limits. And let's compare those two numbers, 2,500 gigatons in the past, and now we have to live, all of us, industrial countries, developed countries, and developing countries, on a meager 250, which is only 10% of what was put in the atmosphere. And that's an important message, because when you handle any serious pollution problem, you do three things. You stop polluting. That's mitigation of the climate. You know, we reduce and stop in 20 years or 30 years. And that's indispensable. We have to do that. But that's not sufficient. If you have a pollution in the river, when you stop polluting the river, the pollution is still there in the river. You have to remove it as much as you can. You may not be able to remove all of the pollution, but as much as you can. And then you have to adapt to whatever is left. So these are the three principles. COP conferences have focused mostly on mitigation and a little bit on adaptation, especially in recent years. The approval or the agreement to activate the loss and damage is adaptation. But it's very small. We're talking about $1 billion. Let me put it in perspective for the discussion about the financial gap. 2,500 gigatons of carbon, if you were to remove them all at $100 per ton, which is not far from reality, but now we're talking about 700, but it could come down. That translates in 250 trillions. If you remove 10%, that's 25 trillion. Over 25 years, that's 1 trillion per year. That's about the level we're talking about in renewable. That's the level we're talking about in other investment. So it's not unreasonable to begin to think about removal. And the US has taken the leadership. Last year, they approved $1 billion for a hub of 3 centers that could scale up the removal technology to 1 megaton capacity. But that's not enough. There is a bill in the US Congress right now to scale that up and spend $3-4 billion a year, 33 billion over 10 years, to scale it up to a gigaton. And that's what we need to reach. We need to reach that level, about gigaton. Now, I say this because really 80% of the population of the world had very little to do with the 2,500 gigatons before. And so we are being asked to embark on a journey. I call it, using the metaphor of the Ark of Noah, you call it the environmental or the climate change salvation ark. And we're boarding that ark with everybody equally. The industrial countries with 2,500 gigaton legacy, free of charge, they are boarding. And the developing countries, 80% of the population, free of charge, no legacy. And now we're being asked to live on 250 gigaton until we fully accomplish the energy transition. That tells you the scope of the problem that we are facing. We need to find a balance. We cannot remove 2,500 gigatons, and we cannot live only on 250. We have to find a solution. One way is to extract from the atmosphere only 250 gigaton at the cost of about $1 trillion US. So I'm giving you this challenge over the next 5 days to talk about it. And I think, as I said, the UAE has taken the leadership in trying to find solutions by this announcement that they made. I think in concluding, I want to just remind ourselves that we must continue in accordance with the UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And we must also factor in that there are things that are happening in the world that will impact our action on the climate, especially other things, many things, but especially war and conflicts. And that's what you're talking about. We have to devote enough resources to stop conflicts before they become war, and to stop wars before they become really impacting the climate action and aggravating the solution that you have so eloquently mentioned. And we have examples in Europe, in the Middle East currently, and other places in the world. We have to put our resources together. So I say that the journey to decarbonize global energy system and achieve sustainability requires an open mind, continuous learning. It should pay equal attention to all of the 3 pillars of the energy trilemma and to the 3 pillars of the climate action that I have repeated. And it should improve the lives of everybody, especially the underprivileged. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your inspiring remarks. We will now begin with session 1, titled Political and Strategic Issues, Challenging International Climate Action. Welcome to the stage our panel of experts, His Excellency Osama Al-Gohari, Assistant to the Prime Minister of Egypt, Professor Ahmed Ali Murad, Associate Provost of Research, UAE University, Ms. Erin Sikorsky, Director of the Center of Climate Change and Security and the International Military Council on Climate Change and Security, our session moderator, Ms. Irina Patrahu, Strategic Analyst at Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Welcome for our first session.
I don't know.
Maybe I can sit. I'm the moderator, so I can sit.
Okay. You want?
Okay. Can you hear me? No. Okay. Now it seems to be working. All right, I'll bring it a bit closer to me. So, welcome to the first session of. I think now it. No. Yeah. Could you lower the volumes on? All right. Can you hear me now? Yes. I see nods on all directions. Okay. Okay. Welcome to the first session of this Transatlantic Council conference. My name is Irina Patraho, and I will be a moderator for today's first session on the political and strategic issues of climate action. And I am very happy to be here together with this distinguished set of speakers and panelists, bringing a diverse set of perspectives to this issue, and I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. And we will finalize the panel with a session of questions and answers, so if you have any questions, definitely please save them for then. It is of utmost importance to have this conversation on political and strategic issues at the COP this year in the UAE, as it takes place at a decisive moment halfway between the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015 and the first expected major milestone of climate action, which is 2030. And unfortunately, today there is a risk that geostrategic competition is coming at the expense of climate action, with negative consequences at all levels of society, including the local and national levels, where vulnerable communities, depending on their adaptive capacity, might face direct and indirect security effects of climate change, and all the way to international security, where the 5 largest emitters of greenhouse gases today don't always see eye to eye on climate mitigation. And this has the risk of decreasing the speed of climate action, and that's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. That's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing, because the window of opportunity is decreasing, and unfortunately the global stocktake is telling us that we are not on the right track to achieve our goals. So against that perspective, I would like to welcome once again our distinguished panelists, and I will start with Ms. Erin Sikorsky. Erin, could you please tell us a bit more about great power competition and the negative or the impact of this on climate action and the energy transition?
Sure. Thanks so much, Irina, and thanks to Trends and the Atlantic Council for hosting me and hosting this important conversation. I really look forward to learning from my fellow panelists as well. So I was asked to speak about the intersection of great power politics and the energy transition as well as climate action, and I was really glad that it was framed that way, because I think too often in international security circles or political circles, sometimes climate and geopolitics are seen as separate, right? And sometimes I have policymakers ask me questions about, well, how do you rack and stack that? Do you put climate above great power competition? Do you put it below? How do you think about it? And I think thinking about the two together is really important, because I don't think you'll achieve goals as a nation in competition with other states if you don't bring climate in, and you won't achieve your climate goals if you don't understand what's going on in the rest of the world. So I sometimes call climate or the energy transition a shaping force on the geopolitical landscape, because there isn't any topic that you might work on or care about that won't be affected in some way. There's actually a professor from Brown University, a guy named Jeff Colgan, who calls this the altered landscape view of looking at climate and the energy transition. He calls it a pervasive background condition that is intrinsically connected to most other areas of interstate competition and cooperation. And I think that's a really important framing for this conversation. So with that in mind, I had 3 points I wanted to make about where I see these issues today on the world stage, and things as we look forward to the future, right, we need to keep in mind. The first one I don't think is going to be a surprise to anyone in the room, and it's quite a bit part of the conversation already. But as we move through the energy transition, we'll have a new set of winners and losers. So a lot of assumptions that are baked in to foreign and security policy around the world will need to be questioned or challenged as we recognize how these winners and losers are changing. As you probably know, the oil and gas production is going to become more concentrated, primarily here in the Middle East. The IEA estimates that we'll see a production rise from 25 to 40% by 2050 in the region. And then in other countries where oil and gas plays a key role in the economy, but it's much more expensive to extract, we're going to see an increase in volatility in those places. So countries like Angola and Nigeria, for example, where you're going to have a huge increase in production costs, yet they're heavily dependent on fossil fuel exports, seeing a decrease in demand. It's going to cause a lot of turmoil and challenges as those countries think about managing that transition. And one thing I'll note here is that, as Irina was pointing out, as the opening speakers point out, we're in a moment where we're already experiencing many climate hazards around the world. So as we're moving to this place of new winners and losers and countries having to manage the shift away from oil and gas, they're also dealing with extreme weather events on a regular basis, right, that are interrupting, in some cases, renewable energy deployment. We've seen this with hydropower in some places where countries are facing droughts. Nuclear also is facing some of these challenges when you don't have water, right? You can't run nuclear plants. So it's a double whammy for states, and they're going to have to figure out how to navigate, especially as these extreme weather events intensify. The second point I wanted to highlight, in addition to new winners and losers, we're also going to have competition in new frontiers. And here I'm primarily talking about getting access to critical minerals that are needed for renewable energy and the batteries and the energy transition. And here, all analysis suggests that to move as rapidly as we want to through the energy transition, the demand for critical minerals is going to greatly outstrip the supply. And so trying to gain access to those minerals, not just the minerals themselves, but obviously the processing facilities, which is the hard part, is going to be an increase in competition. As we know, China dominates refining capabilities for things like cobalt, lithium, and graphite, also for some niche minerals like gallium and germanium. And they've leveraged this control to take action on the world stage in terms of power competition. In July 2023, they inserted export controls on gallium and germanium, and that's a tool they have in their toolbox now, right, in this great power competition. The U.S. is looking at new efforts to break the Chinese dominance. They've developed the U.S.-led Minerals Security Partnership. But then you've also have countries like Brazil and India and South Africa, parts of the BRICS, right, that are very well positioned as well to try and leverage their critical minerals for influence. My center did a study last year looking at lithium deposits that have been discovered in Kashmir and examining the geopolitical consequences of such a discovery there. When you have the tension between India and Pakistan over that region, and who gets access to those resources, and how is that developed in a way that doesn't exacerbate the competition. So I think there's a lot of places like that where you will have emerging and new dynamics. Really, you're going to see countries who are jockeying to set the rules of the road in these new frontiers, places like the Arctic, deep seabed mining as well. I think those are all areas we could talk about more in the Q&A. The last thing I'll say on the second point, though, too, is I think it's really important not just to take the competition we've seen over fossil fuels and overlay that onto the minerals competition and think they are the same, right? We're talking about different types of critical resources, stocks versus flows, frankly, right? Critical minerals are stocks and oil and gas are flows. And so the dynamics are not the same. And I think some of the conversation you see in the United States in particular about worrying about critical minerals dependencies it needs to be more carefully thought about because it's different than oil and gas. All right, and then the last thing I'll say to wrap up, the third point, and I hope perhaps a more positive point, is that competition, geopolitical competition between great powers doesn't mean that all progress is impossible on climate action and the energy transition. I would argue that coordination, while we would prefer it, right? We were happy to see the Sunnyland statement between the U.S. and China, the collaboration there, but it's not a prerequisite for progress. And I think there are some opportunities when you think about things like a race to the top, right, of competition over building new renewable energy technologies. Gaining that access can help the climate and the transition and fit in a competitive landscape. And I think with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and the framing of that gives gives an example of that kind of potentially healthy competition in the context of the climate crisis. I also think it's possible, even in a competitive environment, and again, as the Sunnylands statement shows, that you can find places of mutual national interest between countries, right? I think for both the United States and China, they recognize the risk that climate poses to their own national security, and so they both want to move towards decarbonization in a way that allows for some cooperation, even when competition is the larger context. So I'll leave it there, but thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Erin. Next, I would like to focus on Your Excellency Osama Al-Gohari. Could you tell us a bit more about your insights about the development of climate finance, also looking at the commitments that have been taking place this year, the COP on the Loss and Damages Fund, and where you think this is heading from now on?
Thank you so much. At the beginning, allow me to extend my sincere gratitude for the UAE government for delivering a very successful United Nations Climate Change Conference with unprecedented participation from various countries and leaders, and also with the landmark move by putting the Loss and Damage Fund into operation. This is a historic decision in so many ways, because never so far we have been able to secure just a big decision on one day. Also, I would like to thank the Trends Research and Advisory Team and the Atlantic Council as well for their kind invitation, which allows me to join this great event and for giving me the opportunity to be part in this very important session. The loss and damage is a hot topic here at COP, and I believe that it is an issue of climate justice. Since 2009, the international community agreed on the urgent need to materialize financial resources to support the most vulnerable developing countries from the climate change impacts. They set a collective goal of mobilizing $100 billion annually by 2020 for climate action in developing countries. But since then, and despite the different financial mechanisms that had been established ever since, the progress has been slow. A recent report from the United Nations Environment Programme, titled Adaptation Gap Report 2023, indicated that only the adaptation finance needs 10 to 18 times higher than international public finance flow. The same report also highlights that the finance flow declined by 15% in 2021. Failing to meet the pledged $100 billion since then means less action have been made to limit the current financial gap, and accordingly more loss and damage and more higher costs in the future. According to a study published from the OECD, that by 2025, developing countries are estimated to need around $1 trillion annually for climate investment, rising to roughly $2.4 trillion each year between 2026 and 2030 to bridge the financing gap. Several factors must be resolved, contributed in the failure of mobilizing the required fund, most probably the dominance of loans in the face of the decline of financing grants, beside declining rates of climate adaptation finance, and the lack of institutional, informational, and legislative infrastructure needed for creating an attractive environment for this type of finance in developing countries. I believe that the developed world started to realize that insurance only is not enough. And what had been achieved in COP27 and COP28 records a progress in financing the climate issues. But the scale and access and capitalization is a still very important topic to resolve. Considerable progress could be achieved by considering some further recommendations that could be on the top agenda of the upcoming climate events and conference, including setting a climate finance priority agenda on national levels, beside applying the mechanisms of sustainable budgeting and the climate finance to enable governments to align the general finance with the climate finance goals and formulate green financial policies. Enhancing climate finance governance and applying the mechanism of sustainable budgeting and the climate finance to enable governments to align the general finance with the climate finance goals. Introducing mechanisms for innovation in light of developing countries' challenges and development pressure. I will close my statement by one example. I had this discussion with the speakers where we are sitting in the room. Egypt, for example, Moody Credit Agency had been downgraded Egypt and the impact is that Egypt will have limitation on the access to finance. One of the reasons they have downgraded Egypt is because the sea level rise is getting, there is a environmental risk regarding the sea level rise. So what they do is very simple. We will limit their access to finance because they have a sea level rise. So the loss and damage mechanism, hopefully it will sort out such things and try to think differently to help us tackle our challenges and have the access to finance in order to do what we can to resolve these problems. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Last but not least, I would like to invite Professor Murad to tell us a few more words about, well, being in your role at the UAE University and seeing the important and pivotal role that the UAE has played in this COP. Can you say a bit more words about the role of UAE in unifying responses towards climate action?
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank Trends for Research and Advisory and Atlantic Council for giving us this opportunity to be one of the panelists in their annual conference, especially during the COP28. So that's, I think, will give us a privilege, I think, to contribute to the outcomes of COP28. What I am going to shed light in the efforts of the UAE in mobilizing international efforts to combat climate change. Now, if we look to the history of the UAE, we'll see there are great efforts of the UAE and significant role for the government of the UAE to gather all the people to find innovative solution to challenges related to the climate change and sustainability. Before I give the main reasons, or say the main reason behind this successful efforts of the governments to gather all the people under one table to discuss the climate change in general, I would like here to shed light in the efforts of the government and different projects that implemented during last few years in order to contribute to the development of the SDG goals in general and contributing to the advancement of the solutions related to the climate change, one of which is renewable energy investment. UAE, if we know that, I think, since 17 years ago, established Masdar to play a major role, I think, in investing in renewable energy and finding innovative solution related to the renewable energy. Now, if we look to the history, UAE invested $50 billion in renewable energy in 70 countries. And clearly that indicates how UAE gather all parties together, I think, to find innovative solution to the world. The second things, UAE hosted important global events focused in climate change, such as Abu Dhabi Ascent, which consider or serve as a preparatory meeting for the COP28. Additionally, also UAE hosted COP28, and so far now maybe 5 days, and we, I think, all of us, and witness the outcomes of COP28, one of which I think in the first day, I think all the people, I think, agreed on the lost and damage fund with pledge from the UAE of $100 million. Following that, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, President of the UAE, announced 30 billion fund for climate change solutions. So this is example of how UAE government committed to provide, I think, all the needed support, I think, in order, I think, to combat the climate change problem. Because we believe here in the UAE, climate change is not local issue. No, it is a global issue. So all of us, I think, should work together in order to find a solution for the climate change, for the better future, for the future generation, for sustainable economy, for the sustainable, I think, world. National climate plan, in order, I think, to achieve and to consolidate the efforts of the UAE, especially through the partnership, UAE developed ambitious plan, especially related to the nationally determined contribution in DC to the Paris Agreement. This is one of the important. These commitments outline the country's strategies for reducing greenhouses gases, and also investment in the clean energy technology and the establishment of eco-friendly infrastructure. International partnership is one of the important pillars for all those projects. In order, I think, to use the best practices, we believe that's to use the best practices from different parts of the world and use it and tune it in order, I think, to meet the environment. Maybe last example is investment in climate innovation. UAE encourages innovation in climate-related technologies and solutions. It invests in research and development through the academic institution, through the research center, fostering conducive environment for technologies advancement to address climate change. In general, what UAE consider a unique platform, a unique model in fostering partnership and climate change for the climate action issue. Why that? One is the legacy of Zayed. And the legacy of Zayed is inherited within the practices of different entities in the UAE and inherited as part of even the community. This is one thing. Two, infrastructure. If you look to the infrastructure of UAE has a unique infrastructure to lead in finding innovative solution for the climate change impact. Other things is that if you see here the pledge of the government, I think, to find the solution for the climate change. 3 billion fund, loss and damage fund, and other fund, I think. And also the practice, what we see in the UAE, what we practice the sustainability. And that's, I think, cross-cutting all the entities. Today, what we see is like Trends for Research Advisory, UAE University, and other entities in the UAE practicing the sustainability. And we cascade the vision of the leaders in our practices. For that, I think we are presenting a unique platform. Today, this annual conference of Trends and Atlantic Council is considered a unique platform for the partnership and showed an example how all of us, I think, collaborate together for the sake of future generation. So technological infrastructure, resources are very important, and when you have all of those, I think we'll be able, I think, to reach to your goal. And again, global climate change is a global issue. All of us, I think, need to come together to address this issue. UAE government identified international collaboration as one of the 10 pillars for the next 50 years. And this is clear indication how UAE, I think, will unify and will work to mobilize the different parties, I think, to find the innovative solution. And one last point, I think presidency of COP28, I think able to gather all parties together, involve youth, community engagement, non-government organization in one place to talk and discuss different issues related to the climate change.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, distinguished panelists. It's very important to indeed keep in mind the challenges that political and strategic issues bring for climate action, and acknowledging issues around climate finance, but also winners and losers, and supply chain security, but also to acknowledge that there is still the window of opportunity, and great power competition is not necessarily a deal breaker to climate action. And I think that's a very good message of today's panel. And I would like to open the floor to questions from the public, from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and introduce yourself, and then ask your question. There's a question there. Yeah. No, but I think we can hear you without.
Dr. Stephen.
I have a question for Ms. Erin Sikorsky. Thank you. I have a question for Ms. Erin Sikorsky, which concerns the critical minerals competition, and you also mentioned deep seabed mining, which, as we know, is a bit of a jurisdictional problem because it doesn't really belong to anybody. So could you please shed some light on your thinking in that regard?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think because it doesn't belong to anybody, that's where we're seeing lots of jockeying to set rules of the road now, right? There's a UN process to try and set some rules for deep seabed mining, but it's been going quite slowly, and there are some indications from companies that they're not willing to continue waiting for that process. We also see that, I think, China has really taken the lead in trying to secure rights to different places, partnering with other countries to secure those rights, and to position itself to be ready on deep seabed mining when the opportunities arise. I mean, it's something that's talked about a lot in the Arctic as well. I frankly think, I mean, of all the places to mine the deep seabed, the Arctic is the hardest and most complicated, and not the place you would do it first. But that said, I think, again, when it comes to climate and environment issues, we see China having a very long-term strategic approach to thinking about it. And so they are already thinking about, if anyone's going to be positioned to do it in the Arctic, I think China will be. So I see that as a space of competition, and again, who's going to be the one to set the rules there, and that'll probably be the first mover, frankly.
Here in the front, there's another question.
Hi, this is Serhat Çubukçoğlu from Trends Research and Advisory. Just to follow up on Stephen's question, how would you compare that to the space domain? So space mining, and in terms of like thinking about the global commons in general, and there are no jurisdictions there either. So, thank you.
Right. No, you guys are asking me tough questions that go a little bit outside my my area of expertise. But no, I think there's actually a lot to be learned from the two different domains, and I know there have been efforts. I mean, pre-pandemic, I was at a conference in the UK on exactly this topic, where you were looking at building rules of the road in space as well as in the deep seabed. I think with space, it's even more complicated because you have the private sector playing such a role. You do in the deep seabed as well, but you kind of need state support to manage that. And I think those two areas will be areas to watch, and it's a place where competition in other domains will spill over, right? And so those are high on my list of places that policymakers should really be paying more attention to.
Yes. Another. Yeah, the microphone. microphones are a bit...
My name is Sergio Strobans, and I work for the Institute for Economics and Peace. And sorry for asking you another question, but you're again in my target area there. We are here at COP28, which is basically a UN organization or UN conference, so part of the liberal organization of international relations. We kind of knew a couple of years ago. We are now in a very much more realist world, even offensive realist world, where, as you have said, great power competition is now central. So my question could be, how many more COPs will we have until we reach the point that is great power competition is going to eradicate every liberal effort or every multilateral effort? And the second part of that question, which is in line with the first question, is like, when you look at Germany, for example, who is really focusing now on eradicating the production of combustion motors, which is at the heart of the German economy. Basically, or if we look at overregulation in Europe, isn't this going to harm us? I come from Belgium, so from Europe. Isn't it going to harm us compared to other competitors? And when will we stop investing in climate solutions? Because this is basically making us weaker compared to others. Thank you.
Yeah, two interesting questions. I think on the first one, I'll point to something that one of my other panelists noted, is that COP is one of the few places where you actually gather people from all over the world together to have these tough conversations. And so I would argue that despite being at one of the highest moments of great power competition in recent decades, it's still a place where you can come and have those conversations, which makes it all the more important. And you saw the methane announcement yesterday. You've got China and the US there talking about those things together. So, and I think there are areas of climate action where there are co-benefits to a competitive world. And I would give the example, frankly, of climate finance. I think that's a place, when I talk to policymakers in the United States and say, if one of our strengths in this competition is our allies and partners, many of our allies and partners are demanding greater investment in climate finance from us. And so if we want to strengthen those relationships with allies and partners, we should heed that demand. Not only that, but by strengthening those countries through investment in finance, right, through building adaptation and resilience, those countries will then be better able to step up if we need to ask them for something. So I think there's a way in which these issues are connected, and I think we'll continue to see COPs. Your second question, I worry about the domestic political shift we're seeing in countries in Europe, in Germany, in the Netherlands now with their recent election, in Sweden, some of this pushback. And I think it's complex, and I think some of it's more politics than it is technical in terms of the transition piece. But I'm going to leave that there because I want my colleagues to have a chance to speak up here as well.
Thank you. I was just informed that there is a question right here for the rest of the panel. So please go ahead.
Yes, my question is, it seems to me there is a gap between the scientists and the policy makers, especially in terms of providing the information related to the issues related to the climate change. Maybe that's because of the methodology that used by the scientists, maybe because the policy makers are excelling, I think, in their projects, in their initiative. However, there is a gap now between academic institution and the research center in order, I think, to cope with the pace that the world is moving fast to find innovative solution for the climate change, target 1.5. So what do you think? How can we bridge this gap, and how can research institution in general can excel to, I think, to provide the information to the decision makers in order, I think, to take the correct decisions?
I mean, you've identified, I think, one of the biggest challenges in the climate security space, frankly, that I work in, is the siloing between the scientific community and the security community. And I think, you know, part of it is just that they speak different languages, right? When you talk about risk and percentage risk calculation, it means one thing in science and it means a different thing in policy making and security. So I think the more opportunities you have to bring the two communities together, to build research programs together, right? So that the policymakers are informing the questions that the scientists are asking, right? So that's more relevant to policy going forward. I think that can help. I think you need a lot of cross-pollination, I guess I would say, and more interaction between the two communities to make the science more relevant.
And I would like to add on this topic that in our countries, or in the MENA or the North African countries, we have this very stressful challenges that change our priorities. So any decision maker, he's just focusing on how he will deal with the subsidies, how he will deal with the economic challenges, how he will deal with the foreign exchange rate challenges and extra, and he can't just put financial resources to have this long-term vision or a mid-term vision on how to deal with other challenges. So, and I will also take this quote from a speaker that we were discussing. We don't wake up until our nose on the wall. So this is a challenge that we are having. But totally agree with you that we must take in consideration the research think tanks to bridge the gap between the science and the research centers.
Thank you. Yeah, I see another question here in the front. Is there a microphone coming, or if not, please go ahead.
I'll give it Aaron very tight. Can I ask about Egypt specifically? Thanks. Can I ask about Egypt specifically? Because obviously between the financial challenges that Egypt's in currently, the water challenges, the climate challenges, it's really squeezing Egypt, especially from an agricultural perspective, future farming, enough food. How is Egypt trying to balance those competing requirements? Obviously, they'll get to something Aaron said earlier, in that a lot of these challenges are all interrelated, in this case, very localized to Egypt. But there's only so many resources to put against each of those, even though they're all having an impact on you. Can you talk a little bit about Cairo's perspective and where it's focusing first, and how it's approaching this overall?
Yeah. So what you had mentioned is very important, and this is one of the hot topics that we are discussing even inside the cabinet, and we are trying to come up with solutions to sort out what is going on. So, but sometimes we feel that the international community is not helping us to trying to provide the needed financial resources to tackle challenges like the climate, for example. And regarding the sea level rise, it is all from government expenditure. Of course, we need much, much more, but we are trying to sort out these things within the current capabilities. But it is very important that the priorities are extremely different. For example, the people will eat, or I will fight the sea level rise, we will choose the eat. And this is a challenge. And that's why we were trying to push during the COP27, and right now the UAE just put it in operation. The Lost and Damaged Fund can be a facilitator to help us to adapt with our current climate changes. I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions left in the room? Oh yeah, there is one more question of Caesar. Yeah.
I have a question for Professor Murad, and very interesting to hear correctly about the long legacy of the UAE decades before COP28 on climate, beginning with Sheikh Zayed and then Masdar almost 20 years ago. So my question, Professor, is do you envisage that this momentum that we have, which is perhaps reaching a peak at the moment with COP28, will continue in the future and for the next decades, the next 1, 2, or 3 or more decades, that the UAE will continue to have a leadership role in climate?
I am very optimistic that this moment will continue, because clearly we have, I think, in the government's wise leadership that's, I think, looking for the future generation. And if you look all strategies of the UAE, you will see that all the UAE strategies align with this momentum that already started since establishment of the nation in 1971. This country, UAE, is built in the pillar of the sustainability, and we are continue, I think, in this pillar, continuing sustainability. We cascaded that in our initiatives, in our, I think, even practices. We practice sustainability in the UAE, as you see, and today COP28 an indication, and this is indicate the collective efforts of the UAE, I think, to gather all the world and present the best practices in, I think, finding innovative solution based on the scientific outcomes. I believe will continue. As I mentioned, that UAE clearly identified the pillars for the next 50 years, and one of them is one of which is related in the international partnership. Look to the UAE net zero strategic initiative by 2050. Work together, I think, and all entities, by the way, in the UAE are working in that direction toward, I think, this momentum. This momentum every day increasing because we have wise leadership.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Unless there are other questions in the room, but I don't see any more hands, I would like to wrap up by just one final question to each of you, each of the speakers. I think it's important to look forward, of course, and to make sure that perhaps political or strategic issues haven't been major challenges so far in climate action, but we would also like to make sure that they won't become bigger problems. So if you had to mention one priority to prevent strategic competition from inhibiting climate action in the next years and making sure that multilateral organizations and conferences such as the COP28 continue being successful and countries fulfill their pledges. I know it's not an easy question necessarily, but if you had to come up with one priority for action, what would that be? And maybe we can start with Erin and then finish here.
Yeah, I guess my one recommendation is, I think, take the lessons of this past year, frankly, and how we got from a place where climate cooperation was shut off between the US and China because of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. But then we got back to a place where President Biden and President Xi met in California last month or earlier this month. And so learn from that it's important to keep our eyes on the prize and keep the big picture in mind of what we're going toward, and finding leaders and opportunities. I think one of the reasons that cooperation has succeeded is because of the role of John Kerry and his counterpart and their personal relationship. And so don't underestimate the importance of those types of relationships as well in driving this action forward.
Thank you. Your Excellency.
Anna, my point of view is one of the actions that we should consider very wisely is to rebalance the financial mechanisms to force to invest more on the adaptive part, because this is what the developed countries need right now in order to meet the challenges that they are facing in the climate right now.
Thank you. Professor?
So, in addition to the international collaboration, I would like here to emphasize in the importance of the youth. As you see, I think there is a dedicated conference associated with COP28, and UAE invested heavily, I think, in the youth in order, I think, to take a lead and to be among the best negotiators. And if you look to the team of the president of the COP28, you will find that he is surrounded by the youth. Youth is very important, and we believe that they should play a major role in the future. However, we need to equip those youth and future generation with needed skill, green skills, research and innovation. Maybe we need to increase the finance to the research and innovation in order, I think, to close the gap between the scientific outcomes and even our targets in terms of the, for example, 1.5 degrees Celsius or net zero by 2050 or 2060.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to the audience for the interesting questions and lively discussion. And with that, I would like to close the first session and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Test, test, test. Hello, hello. Test, test. 1, 2, 3, hello. Test, test. Test. One shot? Only one shot. Test, test. I can't stop my test, test.
They are not necessarily essential. 15 seconds. Sound check, 1, 2, 3. I can't, sorry. Sound check, 1, 2, 3, sound check. Hey, sound check. I have 1 minute to finish my work, sorry. Yeah. And the coffee break will sound check, 1, 2, 3, sound check. Sound check, 1, 2, 3. Sound check, 1, 2, 3, sound check. And I'm sorry, brother. Sorry. Sound check, 1, 2, 3. Sound check, 1, 2, 3. Sound check. Check. Sound check. Check. Sound check. 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 Check, 1, 2, 3. Check, 1, 2, 3. Check, 1, 2, 3. Check. Sound check, 1, 2, 3. حبيبي. Check. 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 Sound check. Check. Sound check. Check. Check.
تست 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 تست.
تست 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 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. اوكي بس اذا في مجال بعد اعلى زين. اعلى ها ما تسمعني؟ لا علي الصوت بعد. لا انا ما بعلي صوت بخليهم هم يعلوا الصوت. بس لازم هم يعلوا الصوت من عندهم.
I start? Start? Good. I start خلاص? Okay. Start. Okay. Okay. Welcome back to session 2 of the Trends and Atlantic Council third annual conference on sustainable security. The title for this session is The Effects of Climate Change on Political Conflict. Can you hear me? Okay. Please welcome to the stage our experts. Francis Fannin, Assistant Secretary of the U.S. State Department of Energy Resources. Former. Sherry Goodman, Chair of the Board, Secretary General, International Military Council on Climate and Security. Serge Trubant, Director, Europe and Middle East and Africa at the Institute of Economics and Peace. And our session moderator, Mohammed Al-Dahuri, Senior Researcher and Head of Strategic Studies at Trends Research and Advisory. Welcome.
Thank you, Noor. It's always great to be in COPE, but this time it's different, especially in the UAE with the initiatives and the funds that we heard about last days. It's amazing. So I'm glad to have our super panel here. Noor gladly introduced them. So I want to point out in the beginning that we will concentrate on this session on the notion that says the increasing stress of extreme climate conditions directly amplify existing tensions over resources both domestically and across land and maritime boundaries. Hence, we asked our panel to focus on certain aspects in order to have a holistic view on the topic of this session. We'll start with Serge, since he'll leave us at 2:45, since he has some commitments. And I want to point out at the beginning that there's a device for translation. Whoever wants to hear the translation in Arabic, it's available on your chair. So Serge, from a holistic approach, I want to give you a very, let's say, a broad question with regard to climate. Do you think there is a relationship between ecological threats and the potential for conflict?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's part of the research we are doing at the Institute for Economics and Peace. So for 4 years now, we have been publishing an ecological threat report, which is looking at the interplay between the impact or effects of ecological threats. We don't even need climate change, although we recognize that this is accelerating and aggravating the impact of those threats. So that's on one side, and the other side, what we look at is societal resilience. So basically the capacity to absorb those shocks and to recover from those shocks also. When you make this comparison between the impact on one end of food insecurity, water insecurity, of course, coupled with demographic evolution, because that's basically the offer and the demand, you also look at the impact of natural disasters. When you don't only concentrate on the impact, but you couple that also to the capacity to absorb, so the levels of resilience, which we measure with positive peace, you come up with basically, you identify new countries which might want to receive also some form of climate aid or climate financing, because they might not be so impacted, but they are so lacking so much resilience that societal implosion is really close because of the extra stress that is put on them by ecological degradation and climate change. So that's the first point. The second point is clearly identifying a connection, a systemic connection between the effects of climate change and ecological degradation and levels of violence. This is a reinforced, accelerated, vicious cycle in which one is feeding the other. So we clearly see that. And just to give you a couple of figures before I go into the detail of my answer, we can clearly see, for example, if you increase the levels of food insecurity by 25%, Well, you increase the potential for conflict by 36%. If you increase the levels of water insecurity by 25%, you increase the risk for conflict by 18%. If you increase the impact of natural disasters by 25% again, then you increase the risk for conflict by 21%. So there's a clear, strong correlation between ecological degradation aggravated by climate change and levels of conflict. And of course, this has an impact on people and certain regions of the world. And I think that's important. When you take the main impact, or the main, I would say, indicators that we use, when we look at food insecurity, this is impacting 1 billion people today. It will impact 2 billion people by 2050. When we look at water insecurity, today 2 million people are facing water insecurity, so basically they cannot access, I would say, clear and clean water. This is of course also going to double by 2050. Today already 50% of the world population does not have access to proper sanitation. And of course I can go on about, migration, which is generated by those two topics, but definitely also by insecurity and the effects of natural disasters. We see today, we face a migration crisis about 120 million people, which is about 3 times the number of refugees in over a decade. We were at 40 million about a decade ago. We see today that natural disasters and the impact of those ecological threats are moving more people than conflict, and that's a change in trend in those 10 years also. So when we look in detail at those different indicators, we see the impact today and what is going to happen in about 25 to 30 years from now. One of the most impactful data in this research, and that's really, it's impacting me every year when I'm presenting the ecological threat report, is to see that in the regions most impacted, really where different strategic factors influencing peace and security intersect, it's exactly in those regions. And I would even say we are able to, geocode every data point we use, so we can even look inside of countries where this is happening. But it's exactly at those places that the demographic evolution is the strongest. We will see by 2050 an increase by 62% of the African population. In 2050, there will be more young people in Africa than people living in all of Europe, for example. So it's already problematic today. It's only going to get worse on all the indicators, or most of the indicators, in the next 27 years. I think so that's clearly one point. What we need to understand is the absolute interaction between everything that is happening now and no solutions, or no clear solutions for the next 30 years. We identify today in this research, when we couple both the impact and the resilience, we identify 30 hotspots countries. Those are countries in which there is, of course, a high level of impact and the lowest potential level of resilience. Out of those 30 countries worldwide, 19 are in sub-Saharan Africa. And if I would have a PowerPoint and a map, you would see that almost all of Africa is red and dark red when it comes to this impact. 5 more are in the MENA region, which means that 80% of the hotspots when it comes to high impact, low resilience are located either in Africa or the Middle East. So that's the first focus. If you would look at this map of the ecological threat report, well, I could display to you also the map that we present in the Global Terrorism Index, and you will see there also that the epicenter of terrorism is in sub-Saharan Africa, with almost 50% of all casualties in this region, of course, reinforced also by the MENA region. If I would show you the maps of our Global Peace Index or Positive Peace Index, you would see also a thing, is that those countries most impacted are also in the bottom 40 of our peace indexes. So there's a clear correlation there also between all those factors intersecting the same regions, impacting the same regions, and of course the levels of peacefulness. So that's about the bad news. Let me talk about the good news.
Yeah, please.
Let me talk about the good news. So in the first session, and especially you, sir, you were looking for money. You were looking for finances. Well, every year, the world invests $17.5 trillion in violence. Just imagine if what we could do if we would decrease that by 1 or 10%. And there has been an increase by $4 to $5 trillion in the past 4 to 5 years. So those 4 or 5 trillions that you were looking for before, well, we invested them in violence every year since in the past 5 years. That's one thing. So if we would be less violent, or if we would try to break and insist, systemic thinking, you are where you are, it is path dependent, your system is in the shape it is in, but you can still define your own future. You can define to, break the vicious cycles, turn them into virtuous cycles, and making sure that you have a better future. Well, that's what you could do, is by investing in peace, you can create a better future. And that's at the heart of our concept of positive peace, which is a systemic definition of peace, where you can identify the structures, the attitudes, and the institutions to create sustainably peaceful societies. Well, we see that, just to give you one figure, I'm not going to go into details. High levels of positive peace is coming with high levels of happiness and well-being, but also economical score and ecological resilience. Last figure, an increase by 1% in positive peace equals an increase by 2 to 3% in your GDP. So if you're looking for money to invest in climate change or in the effects, mitigating the effects of climate change, you need to look for a more peaceful future, more peaceful society, and it will be automatically generated. Thank you.
By the way, when it comes to Terrorism Peace Index, you need to follow Sir's Twitter or X account, because he retweets a lot about the index, especially those days. So I'm following you, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Very honored. Thank you.
Let's move to Sherry. Well, Sherry, we know that the repercussions of the climate change extend to various aspects of political arena. One of the prominent topics is the water and politics. Many people are talking about it. So can you kick off on your reflections on this aspect? To be specific, what are the impact of the climate change on existing future transboundary water issues?
Okay, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start a little bit broader, and we'll get to the transboundary water issues. Our first panelist gave us a great overview of the facts and figures, and I'm just going to say a little bit about myself and how I got here and my connection to this field, so I think it puts it in context. Almost over 25 years ago now, I was serving as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security in the United States Department of Defense. And in 1997, I sent the first U.S. Department of Defense delegates to COP3 in Kyoto. And we were not having conversations like this at that time. It was a completely different type of event. It was just the government negotiators, and the focus was on emissions reduction, not the geopolitics, the politics, and not even really the energy transition or the actionism that we see so front and center here. So much has changed in the last quarter century in this space. And from my experience in the United States integrating environmental considerations into and factors into the United States Department of Defense and the military, which 25 and 30 years ago was a lot about cleaning up contamination at bases and then dealing with air and water, improving air and water quality around military activities, and the environmental consequences of war and conflict, which any of you who work in this field know all too well. And then in the 2000s, in 2007, I organized the first group of U.S. generals and admirals to address the national security implications of climate change. At the time, that was not a field that was well known. Now there are many people working in climate security. I think you heard on the last panel from my colleague Aaron Sikorsky, who now leads the Center for Climate Security. I chair the board of that organization. I helped found that whole organization and the field. And in 2007, I spent a year with generals and admirals and climate scientists like Jim Hansen and others. And after a year of kind of learning the science, we produced really the first report on the national security implications of climate change. We characterized climate change as a threat multiplier. That's the title of my book coming out next year. I hope I can come back and talk to you about threat multiplier, climate change, the military, and global security. So, and since that time, there has been growing recognition in the U.S., in countries all around the world, in NATO in particular, the NATO Secretary General is here, about climate change as a threat multiplier for instability. Both initially we thought more in fragile regions of the world, but now it's very clear it's a disruptive force all around the world, even in stable economies. and that we know now that what we call the threat multipliers of climate, increasing heat, drought, sea level rise, extreme weather events, permafrost thaw and collapse in the Arctic, flooding, ocean acidification, we could name more, are all aggravating other instabilities we face in society, whether it's fragile governments. It creates conditions where terrorists can further take hold because people become food and water insecure. And that has been true, as our first panelist said, particularly across parts of Africa, in the MENA region, in Southeast Asia. And so we've seen the confluence and convergence of climate and national security. Now, that's the threat multiplier side of it, and this was explained very well. I'm not going to go back into that. The question is, to me, now, 15 plus years on from that, from that era, what is the opportunity multiplier? How can we actually make a difference? How can we stop some of those continuing conflicts that are aggravated by the changing climate? Of course, a lot of it has to do with reducing our emissions and the energy transition. And we could have a whole conversation about that, but we won't do that here in this panel. But I am very excited about some of the triple net zero nuclear activities going on here and other energy transition efforts. But let's talk a little bit about water and transboundary water agreements around the world. Many of the important rivers around the world are governed by transboundary water agreements, and from the Mekong to the Euphrates to the Colorado and beyond. Most of them were made in an era before we really understood the effects of climate change. So most of them don't take into account evaporating water levels from heat. Many of them don't actually take into account overuse and overwithdrawal of water by the original user. So even in the United States, we see a lot of competition and sort of local conflict about how the water of the Colorado River, which supplies much of California, is going to be allocated. But this is true in many places now around the world. I'd say the good news on transboundary water agreements is that often the agreement and the people who make use of the shared water resource become the people who care about improving its management. And so there are the opportunity multiplier is the engagement at the local level. The fact that this is all happening here and more people, I mean, before I came here, I walked through the sustainability pavilion. And if you haven't done that yet, I highly recommend it. I mean, I wish my kids were here and they were a lot younger because it looks like it's fun for children, but it's also great for adults. And it really puts front and center kind of why we're in this mission to save the planet. And it also aligns, I think, with, to me, what's uniquely occurring at this COP compared to the past is the convergence of climate, what we call climate security risks with peace building and resilience. So you all know yesterday was the day of the announcement of the Declaration on Climate, Peace, Release, and Recovery, to which our organization, the Center for Climate and Security, is one of the signatories. And I believe you'll hear tomorrow in a keynote from Ann Witkowski, my good friend, who is the Assistant Secretary of State, for the title is Conflict and Stabilization. But when you put it in context, it's really more about the stabilization and about climate, introducing understanding of climate fragility risks and climate vulnerability so that we can achieve better outcomes. And when you think about transboundary water arrangements, it's working to develop tailored local solutions with people who are from the region, with those who have also maybe additional data early warning systems. That's why the trends work, I think, that you do that you're doing, that my think tank, I mean, a lot of think tanks now I see it's a lot of it's AI power too. You could go in and go to some of the hubs and see how some of this is going to be taken even to the next level, will enable people to make better local decisions that can improve resilience. Of course, then at the end of the day, it's all about what values you bring to it, how you can conserve your water resources, and having more transparency. Obviously, water sharing has been part of the political dynamic of every region, whether domestic or transboundary, for from time memorial. So, there were many improvements happening in water sharing agreements, between Jordan, Israel, and Gaza until the new war erupted. And obviously that's not happening now. But there are other regions where, from the Mekong to to Lake Chad, for example, where there have been significant improvements in recent decades because people are dedicated to understanding and better allocation of those resources. I'd say the main thing in the future is to integrate the climate change into those agreements so that we will be able to make smarter local decisions.
Thank you, Sherry. Let's move to Francis. So, a very good question that I got in my mind in relation to your expertise. So, how does the eventual reduction of fossil fuels open new areas of conflict?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. It's great to be with you all. Yeah, I think it's absolutely a critical question, because I think we go into, in certain quarters, there's an assumption that if we get off of fossil fuels, get off of oil, we'll have two results. One, we'll have a more peaceful world. And secondly, it'll be less expensive for all of us. There's an assumption that clean energy technologies are cheaper, and that by reducing dependence on oil, getting off the oil economy, it will reduce conflict. And I think it's important to test those assumptions, because if we think about this concept of the energy transition, just fundamentally, in a historical context, we've had multiple energy transitions through history, but those were all technology induced. So there's a new technology is adopted, it's found, it's because it's more energy dense, it's easier to transport, perhaps it's more environmentally sustainable. It becomes accepted over time, and then the government comes in to regulate it. The case of the energy transition, it's completely the inverse of that. What we're doing is coming in, and policy is coming in and saying we ought to get off of the form of energy which is the foundation for much of the global economy, and go to energy systems that we are trying to build a capacity to develop. And we're not just doing that in a vacuum, we're doing that in an era of greater conflict relative to some of the great powers in the world. We're moving from a sense of dependency on certain theaters of the world, a reliance, particularly in this region of the world, to others that don't. And I think we're still are beginning to understand what the results of this really imply, but just the scale of the transition is really hard to comprehend. We have to increase the mining of metals, critical minerals, depending on the metal or mineral, sixfold what is being produced today to even start to scratch the surface. And the time horizon to achieve that outcome does not align with some of the policy targets under the current state. My call here is for bold action, but we're not having that happen yet. It takes 16 years from the discovery of a mine to putting it into initial operation. How is that going to align with the policy-induced transition when the market isn't responding? It's a tremendous challenge that we face, and capital is not being allocated appropriately at all. in this space. And then you overlay that with the context of geopolitical conflict that's on the rise. Moving off of the energy, the current fossil fuel oil economy, and moving to a critical metals, a metals-based economy, which is what goes into an electric vehicle or a wind turbine or a solar panel. This is opening up new frontiers for development, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. And you've heard the earlier panelists speak about those regions and the ongoing threats that they face today. Also, the development of these resources are not being done by those states, like it is in this region. Those countries in sub-Saharan Africa are being developed, those resources are being developed by other country actors in their countries. And it's creating this ongoing conflict. At the same time, the United States and Europe and other great countries, Japan, Australia, others, want their own resource kind of nationalism in their own supply chain. And so what the effect of that is, back to this it's going to be cheaper concept, this is creating a balkanization of the global economy in the commodities sector. This is highly inflationary. So we have to scale up multiples that are on unprecedented levels at a time horizon that seems very, very challenging to achieve. And we have to do it in a way that will no longer rely on traditional supply chains. And for the United States, it's especially a challenge because, China is the world's clean energy manufacturing hub. Significant amount of it is produced in China. It's creating tremendous challenges. And then you have back to the scarcity issue. This region of the world is starting to lead the world in the development of green steel. Green steel is a lot of countries like to talk about it. So this is one of those hard to abate sectors. 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the steel industry. You do not have an economy without steel. So it's critical that we address this question. But only 4% of the global supplies of iron ore meet the quality specifications that can feed into a green steel plant. Where's this going to come from? We really have to start figuring out some of these tough questions so that we can align action, markets, and policy. Because right now they're in disagreement, and we have to create the right kind of drivers to allow for this investment to occur, or we're just going to keep talking.
Thank you, Francis. So let me now open the floor for our audience in case they have questions for our panel. Any question?
If I might just
Sure.
comment on this, on the energy transition, and Frank, I agree that we need to be mindful of not trading one set of geopolitics on energy, the geopolitics of oil and gas, for new geopolitics on renewables and supply chains and rare earth. But we already live in a world full of geopolitics, so we need to understand how to secure those supply chains. Energy transitions are long. Oil was first discovered, in the mid-1800s in the United States. And it was first really developed, in this region, perhaps even a little bit later, okay? But so an energy transition has been at least 100 years. We've had nuclear energy for, going on almost 75 years now, right? So, and now we're on the cusp of next generation nuclear. And so we are in the middle of a great global energy transition that will be ongoing. And we need to be mindful and careful about how we secure the supply chains and not increase risk and vulnerabilities and ensure they are environmentally sound, which is not always so easy to do. But we haven't done such a great job in the current energy era we've in either. So I think that we have opportunities to address those risks if we're clear-eyed about them. We understand how we're sourcing those minerals and materials. And then we also look as much as possible to acquire our new energy as a distributed local energy source with the smallest emissions footprint possible.
Well, Sherry, I have a question for you. Logically, the new trade routes that comes out from the climate change create new opportunities for countries. And here I'm talking about the northern sea route. So let's go to the future, since they are opening some opportunities for those countries to improve their economics. What about the conflicts? What will be the future conflict that will result from the climate change with those new logistic routes?
Okay, well, let's, if we're to talk about the Arctic and the northern sea route, which hugs most of Russia's long coastline, this is going to be the next big global geopolitical challenge. I mean, when I was in the Department of Defense at the end of the Cold War, I led a program with Russia and Norway called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation, and we were working with the Russians to reduce the environmental impact of denuclearizing their country. In particular, the Norwegians at the time were very worried about leaking sunken Russian submarines that might contaminate Norwegian fishing grounds. And so we jointly developed a cask to safely offload liquid waste streams from sunken Russian submarines to be stored inland. Okay, and we did a number of other things to sort of share environmental practices among militaries in that era. That was an era of great cooperation. It was an era when the Arctic Council was established of the 8 Arctic nations, 1996. Obviously, that era has long since passed, and today Russia doesn't participate actually in the activities of the Arctic Council, and we often speak as this region becoming one more a zone of competition and potentially future conflict than of cooperation. And now Putin has big ambitions to accelerate transport across the northern sea route. That's been somewhat slowed by the war, the war in Ukraine. And some of the shipping routes have kind of going more towards Asia now, as opposed to across, if you think of the map going from Asia across to ports in Europe, like Rotterdam. Nonetheless, it's true that you see more and more navigation across the northern sea route. China, too, has Arctic ambitions. In its first formal Arctic policy in 2018, China declared itself to be an Arctic stakeholder, a near Arctic power, and that routes across the Arctic might even be shorter than shipping through this region and therefore be more climate friendly. Now, I take that it's still very difficult to navigate even as the Arctic opens because sea ice is retreating and temperatures are rising and permafrost is thawing. It's still a very difficult transit, and most of it is destination transit today. Most of it is about extracting energy from Yamal or potential, and other resources in the Arctic as opposed to shipping across the Arctic. That, of course, will, over the coming decades, change. And as that changes, there will be increased risk. First, there'll be increased risk of shipping accidents, of oil spills. And oil spills are difficult to clean up in any location. They're probably very particularly difficult to clean up in Arctic waters. They're vast, remote, not well understood. And so these are some of the concerns. And I think China, that we have the other major resource in the future, if we're talking trends here, decades hence, is fish. Because as climate change, temperatures warm, global fish populations are migrating towards both poles. So today, the fisheries, let's say between Norway and Russia, are highly abundant as the cod has moved into that region. And in other parts of the world, fisheries are overfished and becoming depleted. So this is also, our ocean future is very important. I sometimes think China's future Arctic ambition is about the fishing that will eventually be available in the central Arctic Ocean, which today is covered by a moratorium but that only runs for about another decade. And when those fisheries are viable, it could be a whole new world.
Yes, so I have a final question for Francis. Francis, some people say that in a fragile or conflict-affected state, there is a greater risk for climate change to cause instability, unrest, or posing serious threat to human security. But actually, we saw the opposite in the beginning of this year. Some countries witnessed earthquake, and we saw how the international community expressed their sympathy, and some countries opened new doors in order to reestablish their relations with them. So the question is, how can the international community take the opportunity from the climate change in order to end up any conflict in the future?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think one of the things in terms of what the international community can do would be, the issues that we're talking about. Yes, we're going to have the climate change, extreme weather events, stressing food. It will contribute to migration, which will exacerbate tensions everywhere, particularly in the southern hemisphere. Well, I think of course we have to tackle that issue. But in terms of, I think, creating greater opportunities for the people in those countries, I think is a huge opportunity for the international community to help develop some of those resources that are there and allow for and create the incentive structure for the local communities to actually benefit from the development of their own resources. So, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo is the biggest cobalt producer in the world. A lot of that production is being done, non-trivial volume is being done through forced labor and other ways. Another significant amount of the labor is from imported workers from another country. The local communities are not being developed. They're not benefiting from the resources that are theirs. And I think that that's going to increase tensions, particularly when there's the greater, when they have more extreme weather events and they face greater food insecurity, given that the foreign workers in their country exploiting their resource look like they're doing pretty well. So I think that having a greater degree of transparency and inclusion in terms of the way this new energy economy is being framed and built will head off. People don't want to leave where they're from, right? They want opportunity, and having the international community create a greater degree of transparency to help facilitate them to have the opportunity in their own countries, I think is not just a crucial first step, but I think it's an achievable one.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have a very limited time for this session. But let me say that the climate change is, and will be the most imperative case that the international community should deal with, like in those kinds of conferences. So let me thank the panelists, and please let's give them a big round of applause. One last note, there will be a next session after 10 minutes, so please be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think they're going to have pictures.
Yeah, we'll have a group picture.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to see you. Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Thank you, Doctor. أحيانا على نهاية اليوم. I'll just, yes, that's Dr. Khawla, yes. No, I have no idea.
You can just sit here, and then we'll have you sit here, and Dr. Khawla.
Oh my gosh, I'm a magnet in my pocket. Oh.
Because that's even worse, the other is on top. These people in the front wouldn't be able to see my face. Huh?
Nice
Here? But they told me to go closer. Yeah.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Sure. Yeah, sure. Hello. Okay. So you can just, like, whenever your turn is to speak, just towards the microphone, because sometimes it's very difficult for the audience to hear what you're saying, because people have the natural tendency to sit back and speak, but then the audience can't hear. Yeah, I'll do it. Closing it, yeah. Yeah, okay, sure. Okay. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and esteemed participants, welcome to today's third panel on the overarching topic of how climate change shapes the nature of security. In a world increasingly grappling with the impacts of climate change, the intersection between environmental shifts and security concerns has become more pronounced than ever before. Our first panelist, Meredith Berger, serves as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment in the United States. Mrs. Berger brings a wealth of experience in addressing the challenges posed by rising sea levels and coastal resilience. Her insights will shed light on the strategic imperatives for military preparedness in the face of environmental shifts that directly impact naval operations and installations. Next, we have Elsa Baron. Mrs. Baron is a research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security and a co-chair of the Young Professionals Interest Group at the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. She's uniquely positioned to share perspectives on climate hazards and humanitarian responses. And lastly, we are honored to have Dr. Khawla Al-Hatawi, Assistant Professor at Rabdan Academy in Abu Dhabi, providing the UAE perspective on climate change and security. Dr. Al-Hatawi's expertise will provide invaluable insights into the challenges and strategies employed by the UAE in a region significantly affected by climate change. Her perspectives will enrich our understanding of the global nature of the climate security nexus. We'll start off with Ms. Meredith Berger, please. In essence, obviously you have some prepared remarks, but could you elaborate on the specific impacts of rising sea levels on naval operations and coastal infrastructure, and how these challenges are being assessed by your department?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll start giving just a little bit of a framing about, people are surprised to see somebody from the Department of Defense at the COP. And so we are here because when we talk about the impact being existential, that is important for our mission, that is important for partners, that is important for everybody. And then when we talk about our mission, it is a global mission set. And so we have both impact and reach that is consequential. When we talk about climate change, we recognize it as a national security threat. And so when we look at this threat, we look at ways that we can increase our resilience and also reduce our contribution to that threat, because as we think about how we operate, as we think about what drives what we do. You noted that we are looking at things like coastal flooding and sea level rise. We are a naval force. We operate near and on the sea, and so we are seeing a lot of those impacts. And it is everything from an increased mission set to hindering our ability to respond to the disasters that we are called to respond to. And so we are kind of facing both sides of the impact and the effort here. And so as we are looking across how we take this into consideration, it is looking at everything from those first seeds of impact, and so where we are seeing water insecurity, erosion on the coastlines, impacts to infrastructure, because this is an investment that we are making. These are the resources that we need. It is not that much difference between an installation and a community, so our defense communities are critically important as we look at where we are seeing those impacts, and it's a place for partnership. We do better on the front end if we are making sure that we are preventing some of these impacts, so that on the back end, when we see the catastrophic implications and consequences of things like migration, lack of resources, lack of energy, the economic downfall that happens, it all leads to conflict, and the military catches that on the other end. And so we're really seeing it across the full spectrum, specifically as we look at the impacts of sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, changes in salinity level, changes in temperature, changes in the way that we see the migration patterns of large mammals and other ocean species. It impacts the way that we are able to train, the way that we are able to operate, and how we can rely on these spaces both to launch from and recover to, and also for our learning, our families. These are places that all of our sailors and Marines are living and training from as well. So we are seeing places that are our fleet concentrations, like Norfolk, tremendously impacted by sea level rise. Flooding has been a problem there for a significant amount of time now, and we are having to factor it into the way that we're building our infrastructure. In the United States, we are doing a recapitalization of all of our public shipyards. And so as we're doing that rebuilding, we're actually building to a 300-year floodplain rather than a 100-year floodplain. This water is impacting reliable energy and grid resourcing, because the water is actually impacting our energy sources as well. It's impacting our education. Our Naval Academy is another place that is just so terribly impacted by the flooding. We have floods about 30 to 40 times a year, and we are seeing about a 1.7 foot level increase in the sea level rise over the course of about a 50-year time. And so we're actually quite worried that one of our foundational educational institutions will be so impacted that we will not be able to have it there in the future. So really seeing a lot of impacts there in terms of the wide range of what we consider as important in the Department of the Navy, and it is all across the spectrum.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll move to Elsa Baron. The title of her presentation or her comments is as Nexus of Conflicts, Humanitarian Response, and Climate Hazards. Let me start you off with a question, broadly speaking. Can you elaborate on the process of identifying regions or conflict zones where the nexus of climate hazards, conflict, and humanitarian crisis are particularly acute, and how this information informs strategic responses by countries and by international organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think, unfortunately, the answer is that it's very easy to identify these overlapping zones of vulnerability because they're becoming increasingly more common. And so if you look at institutions and reports like the ND Global Adaptation Initiative, it shows a ranking of countries around the world and how vulnerable they are to the impacts of climate change, as well as how prepared they are to respond. And what's really interesting is if you look at the bottom of that list, that is the countries who are most vulnerable to climate change and least equipped to respond. It overlaps very closely with the UN's list of countries that are in active conflict. And so what you see at that intersection are communities who are not only facing increasing climate hazards, but are also facing the effects of conflict, which not only include sort of the direct effects of violence, but oftentimes displacement that sort of puts communities in vulnerable environments and conditions. What's interesting is that IDP camps are often constructed in places that are haven't been desirable for other urban developments, meaning that they might be in a floodplain or otherwise area of vulnerability. And so you see those communities becoming sort of at the height of the crisis, both in terms of climate and conflict. So there's a lot of overlap there. And it's important in response to consider sort of the long-term resilience of these communities. Oftentimes the humanitarian community, which we at the Center for Climate and Security have been increasingly partnering with and working with, has a short-term lens on disaster response, especially when it comes to conflict. But now that we see climate increasingly layering onto that, and we have a good indication of what the climate projections are for the future, what the risks might be, it's really important for the sake of the communities and their well-being to be thinking ahead and planning ahead for how to become more resilient to the impacts that we sort of already know are happening. Finally, I'll kind of note that it's important to understand and anticipate disasters, and this comes down to what you mentioned in terms of identifying the regions of greatest vulnerability, but then implementing early warning systems, and this has been on the UN Secretary General's agenda and is something that different governments are thinking about and investing in as well, but ensuring that communities have access to the information to respond. Oftentimes the information is a lot easier than the implementation, and so that's where policy really comes into play here. So I'll leave it at that, but looking forward to more discussion.
Sure, thank you very much. Last but not least, Dr. Khawla will address the UAE's perspective on climate change and security. And here the basic question would be, how is the UAE integrating climate change considerations into its national security policies, and what policy measures are being implemented to address emerging security threats related to climate change?
Thank you very much. Actually, the UAE being here gathered in COP28 means how much the environment is important for the United Arab Emirates. Being in arid zone and in a desert environment, of course, with the climate change and scarcity of water and food, a lot of strategies and policies has been made. First of all is the law, the National Protection of the Environment Law in 1999 stated how much the important and what are the way that the UAE will deal with such a harsh environment and the effect of climate change. There is a lot of strategies. First of the most important is the UAE Vision 2021, where they state that we need to protect the natural resources. And there's a KPIs and a lot of indications toward and obtain this initiative. The UAE environment, the Abu Dhabi agency started the environment strategy for 2030, where is a lot of initiative to go to protect the air qualities and to reduce the CO2 footprint. Water scarcity really is important for the UAE, and a lot of initiatives has been done, especially the collaboration with the region, as the scarcity of water can lead to conflicts, especially depending on the desalination water and rising of the sea to sustain the water supply and the sufficiency of desalination water. There's a lot of agreements happen between the GCC countries as they are sharing. Having the environmental or climate change as transboundary threats, there's where we all need to co-op and collaborate to sustain the environment. And it's really challenging the UAE to balance between environmental protection and economic growth, as well as the human population growth and their demands. So it's really challenging, but having us here, especially the COP28, shows how much the UAE want to lead the whole world to be in one page to protect the environment and support the reduction of footprint, and having a strategy to have a zero carbon by 2050. This is the best strategy that all of us, all sectors, all industries are working together to achieve it.
Thank you, Dr. Khawla. Now, before we open it up to the public and field some questions from the audience, I'll take the liberty of asking a question of each of the presenters, or we'll proceed in reverse order. So I'll start with Dr. Khawla. Maybe if you could touch on some of the technological innovations and research that the UAE is using or leveraging to enhance its security capabilities in response to climate change, and how these specific technological solutions have shown promise. If you can maybe speak about these issues.
The best investment now be on the renewable energy, having the solar panels. We are having the nuclear plant, the plants for electricity. All of these technologies is using to replace the fossil fuels, depending to more clean and green energy. Of course, there is, we have for innovative ways of agriculture, as we have excessive water, how can reduce or use the desert land to be for cultivation and to reduce the CO2 footprint, as well as we have the big reserve for drinking water, and that's the biggest one in Liwa. So all of these are working together, and a lot of investment in biotechnology to ensure the reduction of CO2 emission and using better technology. There is also strategies on innovation where we can have sectors, especially in agriculture and other environmental aspects, to reduce the climate change effect and collaborate. Or there is a lot of also research has been funded by the government with collaboration regionally, and invest in also in sustainable projects in the region, not just the UAE, to ensure all of us are participating in climate change, and the way that they are measured. The Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, they are in charge for releasing and monitoring these projects.
Well, thank you for shedding some light on this, Dr. Khawla. Next, Ms. Baron, if in what ways can preventive diplomacy be employed to anticipate and address the security implications of the nexus that we are discussing, and how can nations collaborate to prevent crises before they escalate?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and I think for a long time, climate security has been thought of as something that's related to the physical conditions on the ground. And what we're increasingly finding is that when you think about climate security, and in particular how that intersects with adaptation, that often it's more about the local community, the local government, the national government, and the region's capacity to respond, both through preemptive adaptation and also immediate response, and then long-term planning. And so I think the negotiations ongoing at the COP, especially on issues like the global goal on adaptation, are critical to developing that resilience and that capacity on the ground to ensure that the worst case security impacts of climate change do not come to fruition, because communities are well prepared, they're well connected with their local leaders, and the education is flowing to them ahead of time so that they're prepared already. I'll also add the fact that climate finance is essential to this conversation on adaptation, because without the finance, these countries, which I mentioned, are sort of at the bottom of the list of the Global Adaptation Initiative, which are least prepared and least equipped to respond to climate change. Oftentimes that is related very intimately with a lack of funding, and particularly when you see conflict and climate issues overlapping, there's very little resources locally that folks are willing to invest into climate resilience programming.
At the same time, if you look at the climate adaptation funds, like the Global Environment Facility, these funds are disproportionately missing communities affected by climate or communities affected by conflict. So you have not only this greater need, but also a gap in finance access. And so yesterday, a group of nations and also organizations came together to sign the Relief, Recovery, and Peace Declaration, which I'm very grateful that the UAE has organized this declaration and this effort. And part of that is to ensure that finance is reaching conflict-affected communities. And I think that will be essential on the diplomatic side, but also in the implementation side to ensuring that adaptation is able to equip communities to prevent the most serious climate security risks long term. And then if I can just make one final note, I think in terms of transnational relationships, I mean, diplomacy is core and environmental conditions are key to understanding the relationships between states. And it's very important to work towards environmental cooperation and transboundary resource sharing as a pathway towards peace, community building, and security, rather than the flip side of conflict or tensions arising. And in an environment where we're increasingly encountering scarce resources, this is a difficult task, but a really crucial one to ensuring the global and international security of our world and preventing the future climate impacts of conflicts if they were to ensue. So it's really all intertwined and connected in this way.
Thank you. A question to you, Ms. Berger. In addressing climate-induced impacts on coastal areas and naval forces, how is the U.S. fostering collaboration among various government agencies to ensure a comprehensive and coordinated response? So my question is really about interagency collaboration. If you could maybe talk about that.
Sure. It's interagency, but it is at all levels, like Elisa was saying, where it starts at the local level because you can get the best and most tailored innovations sometimes from the people who call the place home. And so these are your tribal nations, your indigenous populations, the people who have for all of time had their family living on this land because they know it. And one of the most impactful things is to understand how nature works, because nature knows how to heal itself. It understands the nature of the ecosystem and that there is give and take. And so as we think about finance that can be challenged sometimes, a natural solution is also a cost-effective solution and an impactful solution. And so at the most pointed and tactical levels, it is that local piece. But then you want to replicate these things. And so as you bring it to scale, that intergovernmental cooperation is very important, both among governments, as Elsa was talking about, but then within governments. So from the United States perspective, the entirety of our federal government that includes the Department of Defense. And so as we're looking at places to work together, it is data on oceans from NOAA. It is making sure that we are integrating that into the places that we are operating and the places that we are making our installations, so that we can actually be predictive in the way that we are both adapting, mitigating, and otherwise implementing some of the finance that is out there, and using our own dollars well. I'm also the Chief Sustainability Officer for the department. Each of our federal departments does have one. And that is also critically important, because sustainability is about making sure that we have the resources, that we have the infrastructure, that when we put a dollar down, that dollar sticks to where we've put it. And I do that so that in the future, every sailor and Marine has exactly what she or he needs to be able to do the mission when we ask them to do the mission. That's the concept of military readiness. And so we say climate readiness is mission readiness, but it takes integrating data, it takes integrating knowledge, and it takes integrating that predictive planning piece, and that's what the military is known for. We are long-term planners. And so as we put down that plan, climate is a consideration in each and every step of what we are doing. It is informing the way that we are making investments, decisions, executing missions, training, and ensuring that overall reliability when it comes to partnership and execution. And so working across the government, that is the cross-cutting consideration, and how we are working together to make sure that we are partnering from the local level to the federal level, and then, as also said, across the globe, because it is always a better thing to restore a wetland than see an entire society go away, and that is what our construction battalions do at the Navy, actually.
Thank you. We'll open it up to questions from the audience, if there are any. Please.
Hi, this is from Trans Research and Advisory. My question is about how does global warming and droughts, how do they affect, for instance, critical passage routes like the Panama Canal? What's the impact of that on U.S. national security and for countries around the world? If you can please elaborate on that, that would be good. Thank you.
Sure, and as you're asking your question, I somehow did not say the word hurricane, and I don't know how that happened, because as we think about global warming, it is the ocean that we actually rely upon to catch a lot of that heating, and because we rely on that, it is the aggregate temperature of the ocean that's rising. So while we see the impact of it closer to the coast as we see storms supercharge and those types of impacts, it is actually the aggregate rising of the ocean temperature is where we can see how that warming is changing when we talk about naval, coastal, and as you point out in your question, shipping and other impacts as well. One of the primary missions of the Navy and actually navies around the globe is to ensure the free and fair passage of the sea lanes, and that is how our economy works, and that's where the Panama Canal comes in as vitally important, and it's running out of water. And that's really, really consequential, because as we were talking about at the front end, it is when we see resources go away and it tips into economic changes that we start to see conflict and discord that can really escalate. And so the Panama Canal is impactful to the security in so many ways. As we broadly define climate security, it is national security, economic security, environmental security, and cultural and community security. And so that is an indicator we should be paying very close attention to. And just like we protect the sea lanes, we should ensure that there's enough water for one of the major thoroughfares that we count on. So those are some of the ways that we're paying attention and consider the impacts for sure.
Okay, on that note, I would like to thank all three discussants for their insightful comments, and I'll hand it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Dr. Christian. So as we conclude day one of the Trans and Atlantic Council Third Annual Conference, I would like to thank our esteemed panelists for their contributions and your enriching discussions. To our audience on ground and to our virtual audience, you're more than welcome to join us tomorrow here for day two. And our virtual audience can tune in using the same link that we've provided today. Until then, have a lovely rest of your day, and thank you so much.
Nice to meet you. Good job. You're welcome.
I love the definition of climate security you put forward as well.
Oh, thank you. I listened to you. I was like, I gotta catch all the things. So good job.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
like today.